Welcome to the Imagine Your Future podcast. Karen and I have a great show lined up today. Our special guest is John Lytle, a director in ISG Smart Manufacturing Vertical. So Karen, you want to introduce today's episode?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So let's actually jump right in. We are watching this explosion of spend in the digital manufacturing space, and I'm excited to hear from John on the trends and drivers behind these trends. If you had to pick one, John, what would you say is the biggest trend in manufacturing today?
Well, I'm going to say that the biggest one is really trying to figure out how to connect the value chain across manufacturing. If you think about designing products, building products, distributing products, and servicing products, I think what people realized in the pandemic was some of that was broken. So the money and the energy right now is how do I connect all of that and then make sense of it and drive efficiency in my business?
So John, I think we all can appreciate how complex the value chain is in manufacturing. So even if you take a car, and let's take a cool car like the Tesla, how would you think about the chips, the chipset, the software, all of the components go into the digital aspects of the vehicle, plus the physical things? And when you think about that supply chain connectivity, what are the things that you think really got disrupted during the pandemic?
Well, that's probably an interesting conversation, Steve. I think we've all heard about the chip shortages that are going on, and that's likely to go on into next year until new fab capacity comes on. But we're starting to see disruptions in steel, various components of the mechanical aspects of the car as well. It's not just all the electronics, the data center that is our car now. We're seeing steel disruption. Certainly the war in Eastern Europe isn't helping that. So I think, we're going to see more disruption before it gets better.
What's that kind of recovery period? How long do you think it'll take us to snap back? Or do you have any idea?
Let's just take the chip example. New fabs are not scheduled to come online or start coming online until early next year. So as you think about that capacity, whether they're making chips for cars or a toaster or, the machines that go on the shop floor, everything is needing some form of a chip, whether it's graphic or intelligence or AI ML driver chips. We're seeing all kinds of use cases, but really we're not seeing the capacity ramping up until probably Q1 of next year from what we're hearing. But to really solve the shortage and meet future capacity demands, we're probably 2 to 3 years off.
Yeah. Hey, John, one of the things that strikes me about manufacturing right now, and again, let's take a look at big manufacturing, if you will. Part of that was always the physical asset, the big factories, the capabilities to do that. But we're seeing more and more of that shift to software. But manufacturers have traditionally had a hard time attracting talent, especially on the software side. How do you see that changing? And what's your sort of perspective on the talent wars that we're facing across the industry, and especially as it impacts manufacturers?
Well, I think, manufacturers are probably learning the hard lesson that we've known in IT for a while is where do you go to find the skill sets? And when your product becomes more and more software centric, you're now fighting the talent war with IT and everyone that's been in the technology business for 40 years. So, we think about India, as big an economy as that has become in the technology space, they're even having wars right now. So we're looking at Eastern Europe, Asia Pac, Latin America, centers of education around engineering and software specifically that can start to build up new captive centers of experience. So I think that's probably what we're going to see more of. But manufacturers that's the conversations I'm having pretty regularly with clients is where do I find the talent?
So if I'm a young software engineer sitting in Central Illinois, what would you recommend to me? I mean, this is Imagine Your Future. So imagine right. I'm sitting there.
Well, and you and I know the city you're speaking of in Central Illinois, so I have to be careful about that because we know who we tell them to go talk to. But, and I think from a software engineer standpoint and in today's post-pandemic remote work environment, the options are really limitless. You could be calling in the high-tech companies in California and working remotely in your wherever you are in Central Illinois, or you could be doing work on projects globally. So I don't think there's limitations based on where you are. What it's going to become is capability, talent. What are the technologies you're working with? And then, what's the cost of that labor? whether it's Central Illinois or Central Czech Republic.
Is the lack of talent the only thing that's driving kind of the capability development within manufacturers? Like I'm thinking of digital, typical digital transformation. Steve and I did a whole series of conversations last year as a, outcome of the pandemic. Lots of organizations took it as an opportunity to digitally transform themselves. And they did a lot of that work by growing capability. Is talent the driving factor, you would say, in not being able to grow that capability, or are there other things at play as well?
Well, it depends on what we talk about in digital transformation. I mean, that covers a lot of ground, whether we're talking product, digital transformation, factory, whatever it may be. So there's a number of aspects to that. Talent is certainly a limiting factor. Organizational change is a huge component of what we're seeing. So changing your business is not easy. It never has been. So organizational change management, how do I operate differently? How does work get done differently? I mean, we talk about the agile enterprise. It is an issue today. The other side of that is, as much as the boards tell their teams that they want to drive new revenue, customer experience, get closer to the customer, and the ESG initiatives we're all hearing about, all of those things have different implication in your digital transformation. So getting the org to change to that, making the business case, those aren't as easy as they may seem. And then really finding the people to get it done, whether that's internally, partners, or some mix.
Yeah, and it's really a variety of everything right now, I think, is what I'm hearing you say about it as we go forward. It's interesting, John, because when we think about digital transformation right now, so much of the focus tends to be on, consumer industries, whether that's banking or insurance or retail, but very much consumer-facing industries. But I think so much of what we're actually seeing on the ground, and I'll kind of put this with Industry 4.0, analytics, IoT, IT/OT integration, is really massive transformation really happening on the shop floor and really happening at the core of manufacturing organizations. Give us your sense of how you see that playing out over the next couple years and what you sort of see as the future for manufacturing.
Well, and I think you touch on it. I mean, we all love to think of, the fancy 5-axis CNC machines with, automated inbound raw material and exporting, doing optical QA, all the fancy things we're hearing about. But the reality is, you're a large, complex global manufacturer with 90 product lines in 5 segments around the world. You're doing manufacturing, parts manufacturing. The biggest problem you're going to run into is I'm going to have a plant somewhere in the world that is manufacturing a critical component that's still using old Bridgeport mills. They have their share of tech debt, is the simplest way to put it. So managing, how do I sensorize that old Bridgeport mill in its most basic ways that I can, or do I replace that with something else? And then the concern is, do I break the flow of whatever that material flow is through that shop at that time? So you can't just rip out that tech debt, much like we can't rip out old Unix systems or mainframes. You have to be very thoughtful in how you do that. And sometimes the business cases aren't as easy in an isolated location. So as the business cases become the greater good, if they're making a component that's used by another factory in another region, so I manufacture in one location, ship to the other region for finishing and assembly, they ship somewhere else because they're making the next subcomponent up or subassembly up. As that BOM comes together to make the final product, I have to make sure there becomes a new weak link somewhere in there. So that it's a matter of working through all of those. It's just not as simple as saying, I'm going to go automate that factory. Yeah, but it will happen. I mean, we talk about it as a transformation over a couple of years. It will be a transformation over a couple of years. Big plants that have more of the connected machinery and robotics, those are the easy ones to do. The hard ones are some of these legacy component shops that are out there.
I think, John, what I'm hearing is we're still tied to the weakest link within the chain for the whole supply chain. But I think a lot of what people did, especially during the pandemic, is looked at really building redundancy into that chain. Now that introduced all sorts of other aspects to it.
Right.
Yeah, all sorts of new problems. Exactly right. How do you feel about the redundancy that we have in the broader supply chain today and the plans to sort of further increase redundancy? And then maybe even into that, some of the nationalistic talk that we've heard about bringing manufacturing home, whether it's made in Canada, made in Britain, or made in the U.S., bringing that overall supply chain closer to home. What's your sense of that? Can we do that? Is that feasible in some areas? And just give us your sense there.
Well, I think it's reasonable to do. We've all been around long enough that we remember the globalization conversations, why so much workload moved to, if you think of NAFTA, so much moved to Mexico, or it moved to offshore locations like China or India, or wherever it may have been. So now I think what people have finally come to realize is that was the weak link in their supply chain. They put everything in one big massive relationship overseas. And when that became a problem for shipping or material reasons, or just global economic reasons, they didn't have a fallback plan. So everybody had to scramble post-pandemic when they couldn't get things out of China or Europe or wherever it may have been. So I think the idea, much like what we're hearing in the chip shortage issue, we're building at least 4 fabs that I know of in the U.S. to address some of the problems with supply chain and capacity that were coming out of Asia Pac. Is that unreasonable? No, I think it's fair to do it. Will the economics change in the cost of those chips? Well, I think we all know they probably will, but we solve a risk problem to the business. We think about what's happened to the auto manufacturers in the last 2 years. We all know that shipments are extremely low. I just saw another article recently where one of the manufacturers had to shut a plant down for 2 weeks just because they can't get chips. Not one chip, not your heated steering wheel chip. They couldn't get chips. So they just shut the plant down. These are guys that used to run 3 shifts, 7 by 24, 365, maybe 2 weeks off in the summer to reconfigure a line. Those days are gone right now. So until this capacity comes back on in Europe, European fabs, we're hearing multiple fabs in Germany going to come online, but that capacity is 2 years out. So we're fixing supply chain risk. It's not simple.
You've got a number of governments who are doing mining initiatives to get the raw materials needed to make the chips. And that's not a short-term process either.
Yeah.
But it is going to address a longer-term need. And Steve, to your point, it's part of, I think, a lot of countries' go national strategy. I wanted to pick up on another thread in the conversation that you mentioned, John, and that was about business models. So one of the things that I noticed about manufacturing coming out of the pandemic was a lot of manufacturers adjusted their market strategy to include selling direct to consumers, something that they had never done before. How, in your opinion, do you think they handle that change? Will that continue, and were they successful?
Wow, there's probably a lot in there to unpack. I mean, measures of success may be incremental percentage points. So if I can drive revenue or margin or customer experience by 5%, that's pretty meaningful to some of these companies. We've got a project right now we're working on. We're trying to solve, they themselves measure themselves at 90%, 92% effective. They want to solve that 8%. So we're looking for, that solving, if I can solve 4% of the missing 8, that's 50 million in net new revenue. If I move close, you think about what's going on in the automotives, and setting aside the Tesla example as kind of the kind of premier child for the software-driven vehicle environment, but everyone else is scrambling right now to get that Tesla model. So how many updates does your car get every day? Not quarterly, not annually, but every day. What's the in-cab experience? So that fancy screen, 8-inch diagonal screen you've got in your dashboard today, are they pushing new content there? Is the content I care about? But even for the backseat, the infotainment centers, the subscription models that are being pushed to the car without the dealer, straight from the manufacturer and their partners all the way into the vehicle. We're seeing the same thing in a number of other areas. So, you think about industrial manufacturers, that smart city is a great example. I can't build a smart building unless I have all the components, elevators, HVAC, security, all connected. That then extends out to what's the experience in that building. So you get into the elevator, what's the little ad that comes up on the screen in the elevator? So content is what they're trying to get to, as well as, I want all the maintenance and performance information, predictive maintenance and analytics and all those wonderful things. But ultimately, they want to get down to drive new revenue through the customer experience.
So, John, do you think that becomes then a broader movement to devices as a service or manufacturing as a service, and not like the Foxconn example or the Jabil example, but where the service itself, and let's use your elevator example, where you're really paid for uptime and the whole experience is part of the service? What's your sense on that, and what does that mean for large manufacturers to switch to that sort of model?
We're seeing more of it, and I think it varies by industry. We've heard the Volvo example. You pay for the basically the hour of consumption of your vehicle. So it's car as a service. Even though that car may sit in your driveway for the next 2 months, you only pay for the hour you use it. GE on large aircraft, they're paying power by the hour, basically. So we're seeing more of these models come out. I think the struggle or the challenge that people are trying to overcome, building a good example, if the elevator is only running from 7 in the morning to 7 at night when it's an office building and that's when people are present, is that what I pay for? Is that a model that's sustainable? Maybe it is. But I think we'll see more of this, to steal the phrase again, power by the hour. We'll see more of that come out, I think. And we're seeing companies try to figure out how to get to those economic models. But again, making it work consistently from one building to the next, one car to the next, does it still make sense? I don't know. But I think you'll see more of it, Steve.
So, John, I think that's a great point on the power by the hour. And when we look at various things, and let's just take the airline industry and, the manufacturing side of that. So the Airbuses and the Boeings of the world, certainly when they work with the Rolls Royces and the GEs of the world, they've built in analytics in the engine, and even Rolls Royce or GE will now charge by the hour that they do instead of the capital outlay that's associated with that, which is incredibly creative. When you think about the operations, though, in that kind of environment, so the integration of IT, the integration of operational technologies, so the OT side, the integration of engineering to make all of that possible, what do you see as sort of the big trends for either the manufacturers or the service providers that participate in that market, and how they can benefit from these global changes or mega changes that are occurring?
Well, I think there's probably two things. We've all seen the traditional service providers partnering up with the hyperscalers, and the hyperscalers are moving down into the value chain. So they're bringing connected factory, connected product solutions or frameworks, either directly or through their channel partners to the industries. But the other side we're seeing now is that the service providers are building that edge center solution. So what analytics needs to be at the edge of the plant, what needs to roll up and go to the cloud. Where I think we're seeing the service providers really making some traction quickly is building that kind of a data strategy. Because I'm not saying the manufacturers can't get there. I don't think they can get there at speed. So what's happening is the service providers are bringing in the dashboards, the frameworks, the connectivity, the relationships to effectively do manufacturing, digital manufacturing as a service, without owning the plant.
No, I think that's good. And the great thing about manufacturing, maybe more than any other industry, is they've always been exceptional at managing the broader ecosystem. So you think of Henry Ford and building the first assembly line and having parts come in from others versus trying to own everything. You think of areas like Detroit where there's so many different organizations and companies that support that business. So I don't think this is going to be tremendously different either. I think they'll be able to pull in a broad ecosystem, and that ecosystem will just start including AWS and Google and the other components. I think that's a good perspective. Let me ask a follow-up though. You mentioned ESG at the beginning, and certainly the big push that we all have to do to reduce the carbon footprint and emissions. What's your sense on the EV movement that's taking place right now? But more broadly, what do you think the impact to the automotive sector is going to be with such a massive disruption as we move to, call it even 30% of vehicles being electrical by, call it 2030, 2035, you name the year?
I think there's, a number of things. It's the technology advancement is going to be the biggest issue, mainly around not just what I'll call the drivetrain, so the engines at the wheels, the motors at the wheels, but it's really around the battery technology and the ecosystem to recharge those batteries. And then on the back end, I've not seen a really good solution to recycle all these batteries. So I think there's a number of things that'll get fixed over the next few years. We're already starting to see advances in battery technology. Drive motors are getting more efficient. I think there's a couple of things. Recharge infrastructure in the countries has got to get solved, because you think about it, if you have a post-World War II house, you probably have 100 amp service to your house. Plugging in a couple of EVs at night, you might as well turn off the refrigerator and the TVs and a few other things. But more broadly, the neighborhood infrastructure isn't built to support all of those homes plugging all of their cars in. So there's still some issues in the infrastructure outside of manufacturing that needs to get solved. But within the car itself, new battery tech that was just tested in, I think it was Troy, Michigan, 900 hours on a single charge in a Model S. So the technology is coming, but it's getting it to scale, and then making sure everything else around that drivetrain really gets solved as well. So do we have the most efficient engines? Everything else, all the other parts. I mean, the cab is the cab. The body, sheet metal is the sheet metal, whatever style you want. It's, what does that bottom pan look like that's got the drivetrain and the batteries? So I think as they solve that and some of the other supporting infrastructure issues, 3 years, 5 years, pick a number, but there's some work to be done.
With the emergence of more, smart, connected IoT devices, I'm hoping that we're leaning more towards products that are sustainable, that are reusable, that are recyclable, like parts of the EV. And hopefully some of our throwaway culture that we have will be, a thing of the past.
And Karen, sorry to cut you off, but I mean, the other thing we've got to think about is making cars is still not easy. The carbon footprint of an automotive plant is massive. It's getting better, but they've still got issues. They're producing electronic vehicle EVs, low carbon footprint, great. That factory is really what they're trying to get to. How efficient can they produce that? And can we do it in such a way that even if I take 10% of their power consumption out of that plant, because they figured out just the right way to tweak the line, that it doesn't go too high on the curve, on the power curve, and it doesn't drop below kind of that perfect harmony in the plant. But you get the right throughput, right quality. You're really not overrunning the plant capability and capacity. So I think there's still some work to do in the plants. And I don't want to just pick on the automotives. Anybody that manufactures anything has a heavy carbon footprint. That's just a reality. But maybe the good news post-pandemic is we've started to see this consistently hit board level agenda, which, go back 2 years ago, no board was thinking about, the carbon footprint in a consistent, meaningful way. And everybody has to be able to report it. They've got to be able to manage it and measure it. So I think some of the work that's going on right now is being honest with themselves. Can we actually measure this? And
Isn't that the cool part of digital twins, right? So you could set up your scenarios and simulations and run it ahead of time and see what the impacts might be. How do I make the production less,
But I think that's another one of the use cases of the smart factory that we haven't started to tie all this together. So I get a really efficient flow and power consumption through my line. One, I get better product quality and throughput. Hopefully that translates to revenue, but I also get good ESG scores because now I can manage it, I can measure it, I can tune it. So things they couldn't do when all of this was the old Bridgeport Mills, all of that comes together to solve a number of use cases that are on board level agendas.
Yeah, I think that's fair, John. Hey, John, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. As I've listened to it, I've learned so much about where the market is going, how we think about it, and sort of the key trends that are happening there. So thank you. Karen, you want to wrap us up?
Absolutely. So if you love the conversation today as much as we did, you can always go to our website at www.isg-1.com/podcasts to listen to more content by the Imagine Your Future team. Or you can subscribe wherever you get your regular podcast content. Thank you, everyone, for lending us your ears, and we look forward to next time.